In this episode, Professor Mika Lavaque-Manty, Director of the Literature, Science, and the Arts Honors Program and faculty member in the Political Science Department at the University of Michigan, joins for a discussion on the student crisis of well-being and anxiety on college campuses, the toxic ideology of overwork, becoming an athlete as an adult, the positives, negatives, and false dichotomy of wellness narratives, fitspiration and the role of looks in wellness, safely and meaningfully channeling competitiveness, acknowledging uncertainty, identifying reasons for hope, senior cat and pit mix adoption, becoming a pet parent for the right reasons, our choices as sources of meaning, and more. In this conversation, I share personal experiences with overwork, competitiveness with others and self, addiction to fitness metrics, doping, finding empowerment, and coping with anxiety through vegan and plant-based food choices and caregiving, animal adoption, and more.
Hello, and thanks so much for joining. I'm Erin McCann, and I'm very excited that Professor Mika Lavaque-Manty, Director of the Literature, Science, and the Arts Honors Program and faculty member in the Political Science Department at the University of Michigan, is joining us today. Mika, thank you so much. I'm excited for this conversation. And I'm always impressed by the breadth of your interests and areas of focus, and especially including how you apply philosophy and ethical principles to your daily decision making. Can you tell us about what you're working on and what you're most excited for this year?
Thanks for inviting me, Erin. I'm a faculty member, so I'll talk a lot, and I'll begin by backtracking a little bit from this year to how I got to do what I'm doing. So I'm trained as a philosopher, and I am also what I call an adult onset athlete. I became an athlete in graduate school, and maybe that's an occupational hazard to be engaged in PhD work on maybe the most cerebral of disciplines, and then beginning to think about all the practices I engage in, thinking about how learning physical things like sports, I was doing martial arts in graduate school, is related and not related, and similar and not similar to the academic and intellectual things that I was doing. And my work is on ethics and political philosophy. I'm now a political theorist in a political science department. So I've always been interested in political questions in a sort of meta sense. I'm increasingly less and less, dogmatic, I hope, and less dogmatic than I used to be as a younger person. And so my political interests are not exactly activist interests. I'm interested in these questions to always to take a step back, thinking about different perspectives. And that combination of things, becoming an athlete in graduate school, being a philosopher, and being a political philosopher that doesn't necessarily identify very strongly with any particular political position, has gotten me thinking about reflecting on all the choices we make. And because I'm a political theorist, also my work is not focused on what is government or things like that. All of those are important questions, but thinking about things like consumers' choices, personal choices, the things we do in our everyday life. And that's taken me a long way to lots of things, to switching disciplines from philosophy to political science. And then over the last 7.5 years, I've been the director of the honors program here in LSA, as he mentioned, and recognizing all the issues that our students are dealing with. So it's very common for us to think about our students when we're faculty as existing only in our classroom, only taking our most important class. And then when I began running the honors program and engaging in student advising, I realized that their whole experience, of course, I hadn't realized that students are full persons and have lives outside my classroom, but really recognizing the way in which we had a crisis of well-being for young people well before the pandemic. And now one of the thin silver linings of the pandemic is that more of us in academia and elsewhere are recognizing that. But so that was one of the key things. And backtracking a little more to a research project about 10 years before I began that work, was a project that studied debates about the education of children, from the education of children in the 18th century to contemporary issues, things like doping or Title IX and things like that. And the theme was equality and excellence. And in that research project, I ended up thinking a lot about higher education and education in general. There were some cool ideas in 18th century Europe about education that got me thinking, these would be cool. Why aren't we still doing? Why are we still not doing the interesting things? And that's a context in which I started doing what we now call academic innovation, which is the context in which I got to know you, Erin, trying to think about how could we do higher education better? And that's gotten me finally thinking about what I'm excited about right now, have been excited, which is how to improve higher education, how to improve the experience for young people. One of my pet peeves is Gen Z and Gen Alpha bashing. Our generation tends to think that kids these days, quote unquote, are cuddled snowflakes who are so narcissistic that they do nothing but stare at their phones. And I think that's false. So when my colleagues complain about grade inflation, it's true that grades have risen, but it's also true that it has gotten immensely more difficult to get into selective colleges and universities and things like that. So all of these things have gotten me thinking about how do we improve the practices we have so that we could do something about the crisis of well-being for young people in particular in this very complicated historical moment, global historical moment in which we have climate change, crises of various kinds, polarization, political polarization, all of which I think affects the things that I more closely look at, but aren't always immediately connected. That's a long way of talking about the sort of weird constellation of issues that have connected questions of children's education in the 18th century to doping, to student well-being, to technology in higher education and things like that. And I guess what I'm excited about right now, for the last couple of years, I've been working on a book that's probably not an academic book, and it's with a former student. And right now the title is I'm Fine and Other Lies College Students Tell. And it is thinking about the myths of what higher education is about that generate all these really problematic practices for students. Our students are not bad people, but they have been damaged in all kinds of ways to the toxic ideology of overwork, competitiveness, and issues that actually impede their flourishing and the likely success. So that's one of the challenges that we're dealing with. And that's what the book is hoping to address.
Thank you so much. These are incredibly important themes, and I want to make sure that we unpack as many of them as we can. And I think we'll start to make sure that everyone's on the same page with what we mean by wellness. So we've been hearing about wellness and about positive choices, whether for 2024, New Year's resolutions, and more related to health and being, even more with the kickoff of the new year. When you think about wellness, what does that mean to you, and especially in the context of better supporting students and this evolving concept of what the role of higher education is? And we can certainly unpack that in more detail, but want to make sure we start out with clarifying what all is included. We've talked a bit previously about how fitspiration and social media certainly play a role in that, but would love to hear your thoughts when we think about bridging these concepts that we may not always think about conceptually. How would you suggest we think about wellness, at least for the course of this conversation?
There are lots of ways of thinking about wellness, and I don't want to redefine it. I think I'm happy to subscribe to the sort of holistic, multifaceted conception that many institutions right now embrace, including the University of Michigan, what people sometimes call the eight-leaved clover, that has physical wellness, psychological wellness, but also broader things that often surprise at least my students as being included in wellness, like spiritual wellness or financial wellness and things like that. So I'm happy to endorse or embrace that conception. What I'm particularly interested in thinking about, and I think my earlier comment hopefully alluded to that already, is a kind of false dichotomy. There are lots of interesting critiques of contemporary wellness culture by cultural critics, both in academia and outside, that talk about how it's implicated in global capitalism. People use the term neoliberalism, which I can't stand because it usually just means anything I don't like. But people talk about these sort of macro social issues of wellness. And those are, whether I agree with any particular critiques, those are valuable ones. So it's important to think about wellness culture as a macro social phenomenon. Then there is the hyper individualized wellness culture, which comes up especially on social media and things like fitspiration, which I want to elaborate on in a minute. And that those two discourses seem disconnected from one another. So people who make New Year's resolutions and see a cool post on TikTok or Instagram about what they should do this year might not be thinking about how that is connected to broader issues of high tech culture, the business and the political economy of high tech culture, what people call global capitalism. And then people who say, I have a colleague who has explicitly said workplace wellness programs are fascism. People like that don't think about the importance, or don't often seem to think about the importance of personal choices, that wellness actually is an individual thing and it is about what we do. So one theme throughout my research work has been on the idea of autonomy, which is focuses on the individual's matter. But of course, individuals are in a context. So I'm interested in thinking about how do we have a conversation about these personal choices, which are important. You have to go on living, you have to go on making changes and choices all the time, while recognizing that they are unavoidably connected to broader structural issues, some of which might be problematic and some of which might be not problematic. So that's my overall approach to these issues. And I do it in my class called Wellness, and thinking about microsocial and macrosocial issues, how they work together. But then I also, for personal reasons, I'm interested in my choices, the choices I started making in graduate school when I became an athlete. When I was a teenager, I was mainly an out of shape smoker who was not interested in any kind of physical activity. And again, back to the point that when you're a PhD student and become interested in sports, you start thinking, I wonder what this means. So I'm interested in those choices. And then I see them affecting me in positive ways. So I have been pretty much working out in different ways since 1995, almost virtually every day. There have been breaks. And I've been inspired by lots of things. I discovered at some point that I was a decent runner, and I also discovered that I was competitive. So I want to recognize that about myself. I also want to recognize the fact that I'm inspired by different kinds of things. So all of these things, navigating these trends about personal choices, about our own wellness, have been really important. And the final thing I would add is that I'm right now in my late 50s, beginning to think a lot about aging, and having recently and witnessing my generation, my parents' generation, having not necessarily made good choices about aging and what we now know about aging, cognitive, physical, and all of that, thinking about those issues a lot. And I'm thinking about those for myself. I'm thinking about the choices for our students. I'm thinking about, again, the culture of the toxic ideology of overwork that often lead our students to not take care of themselves. So sleep hygiene is one of the easiest examples of where students are doing really bad things, even when they recognize that they're doing that, partly because of sort of external pressures. So there is the macro social issue, the toxic ideology of overwork, and then thinking about how to get our students reflecting autonomously on these choices and without imposing my perspectives on them or stigmatizing some practices. So let me be more concrete, and particularly why I want to talk about fitspiration, which is an interesting phenomenon. First of all, it's interesting because it's an instance of the impact of social media on our practices, not just young people's practices. And it's an example of the way information is often acquired by what we might call lay people, that is non-academics, non-experts, and for better and for worse. So it's low bar to access, helpful information about fitness on social media. It's also risky because you never really know how high the quality of the work is that you encounter. And then it's often connected in problematic ways to wrong kinds of incentives. So fitspiration, I used a couple of academic studies in my class on fitspiration, where we tried to replicate the study that a couple of scholars had done on they had looked at thousands of fitspiration images and coded them for things like who is presented, what body parts are presented, how the body parts are presented, with what kind of clothing and things like that. And nobody will be surprised that it is highly gender, it is often sexualized, and or sexualized in lots of different ways and gendered in the ways that easily create a kind of, for men, for masculinity, a kind of macho culture, and for women, this sort of hypersexualized culture that's often also unhealthily, according to doctors, unhealthily thin, and all of those things. So I started using that as an example in my class to have us think about the impact of social media on our choices. And the challenge for me, and here's how to think about this as sort of ethical practice of teaching, how to do it so that I don't actually prevent people from engaging in healthy practices, that I don't guilt trip them for their choices, that I don't stigmatize certain kinds of practices. And I can talk about an example of a discovery that I had in this class over the years that I taught it. I had a version of an assignment where students were invited to track something about their practices, whatever their practices were, throughout the semester. This is a class into social science research. So it was like autoethnography or quantified data, N of one. We talked about quantified self. And I thought it was a cool assignment, and I think it's a cool assignment, but many people ended up doing things like tracking how much weight they lost. And again, in terms of gender, there was a somewhat disproportionate distribution on those choices, not perfect because gender works in complicated ways. But I decided that this is problematic, but I also didn't want anybody to feel like, oh, my choices are bad. So I just ended up not using that assignment, and instead had this sort of slightly more removed way of looking at fitspiration, like having us analyze, as if we were academics, what we see on social media and thinking about what is presented, and then recognizing like, oh, this is like how it works for me. I find myself inspired by this particular lifter or this particular athlete or this particular CrossFitter or whatever. And that's good if it makes you want to take care of yourself. But then you might also hopefully start asking, to what extent are there messages here that also suggest that wellness is actually looking good? And that's also complicated because there's nothing wrong in wanting to look good, as long as looking good isn't in some ways oppressive. Like looking good can include, if one wants to look good, include various kinds of body types. It can include different types of social identities, different kinds of choices, and so on. So that's how I'm thinking about these much broader issues through these, what I call microsocial personal choices, getting students to reflect on them as instances of broader phenomena, but not abandoning them. So that's a long-winded way of answering how the wellness culture can maybe work well when we are reflective of the broader context, without concluding like my slightly dogmatic colleague who says workplace wellness programs are fascism, which is to me simplistic.
I hear you. And there's so much to what you just shared. And I want to respond to a few different things from my own experience and some thoughts for continuing the conversation. First of all, I would say when it comes to themes that have come up a few times in the course of our conversation, this point around competitiveness, has certainly come through both in terms of your own kind sharing of your self-reflection, certainly what we have seen cultivated in various aspects of higher education, and it sounds like a key theme in terms of the book that you're working on. And I would say when I think about competitiveness, it is also something that I identify with. And I used to be someone that compared myself to others, particularly when I was in undergraduate as well as in graduate school. Took me time to learn to channel that into competing with myself, but it's not always necessarily a great solution in and of itself when it comes to navigating wellness, when it comes to recognizing my own behaviors and approaches and what motivates me. And so when I was a student, particularly in my undergraduate experience, I was going through simultaneously a breakup, a job search process, and the first time I wasn't going to be a student anymore in terms of wrapping up my senior year. And the combination of those things was very overwhelming. And instead of dealing with that and understanding how to deal with that, or taking time to recognize all the different ways I could constructively deal with that, I channeled my energy into grades and the job search process. And all of those things looked great on paper. So the I'm fine response was certainly something that I was leading with, and I was not fine. And the conversation around mental health was very different then. I am grateful, as you mentioned, that the conversation has widened and increased since the pandemic. And we could have a whole conversation about how things were different then and what has changed and what needs to continue to change. But my competitiveness was very much channeled into things like grades and jobs and not really focused on where I try to channel it, which is in self improvement. But even when it comes to wellness and self improvement, I am very addicted to fitness stats. And that can manifest in things like pushing myself, if unbounded, to go faster and longer every day on the treadmill, which is not sustainable, which led to plantar fasciitis. So there are certainly things that I can be helpful for myself in tapping into that. And I can also be my own worst enemy. And your point about aging is the thing that I try to keep in mind when I recognize that, yeah, I may be breaking my streak today, but I want to be able to do this in 10 or 20 years. And that mental exercise is still hard. And it's still something I grapple with on a day-to-day basis. I can talk more about those themes if we want to dig deeper there. But I think your point about recognizing there isn't one solution for everyone, recognizing that what works for people needs to be up to them, but we also need to have a wider conversation around the positives and the not as positive aspects of the ways that we can take a more comprehensive view to wellness are really important. Can you talk a bit more about some things that you have found particularly helpful in supporting students, whether we're thinking about wellness, whether we're thinking about the point you made earlier about climate anxiety and more?
As before, I'll backtrack a little bit. When I think about, I want to talk a little bit about competitiveness as an example of something that's helped me think a lot about how to help students, how to think about broader issues. When I was in grad school, I got involved in martial arts, Aikido, which is a non-competitive martial art. And it was awesome in all kinds of ways, but its being non-competitive ended up actually generating this horribly insidious culture of competitiveness at the dojo we were in. I was involved in this teacher training program, and maybe again, this sort of domain identification. I want to be good at this, which is true for many of our students, was true of you as a senior. And so it's true of many of us when you have domain identification, it's not that you necessarily want to beat somebody else, but your sense of self is unavoidably connected to doing well at that practice. And it can lead to horribly problematic focus on grades because it's easy to focus on things. So in this particular martial art, in this particular dojo, I don't want to blame it in general. The fact that it was fully non-competitive meant that everything was competitive. Everything those of us in the teacher training program did was we invented these senses like, this is better than that. And, oh, the sensei likes you more because you helped the sensei more or whatever. And that was horrible. And then I got into running, racing, competitive running. And that was actually really liberating because I realized that there are races. And when I race against my friends. I try to beat them. I do everything I can to beat them. But when we're working out, when we're training, when I'm doing training by myself or training with my friends, there's no point in being competitive there because it's actually not helpful because it leads to overuse injuries, as you pointed out, and other things. So one of the lessons I took from that discovery was to think about the way in which those of us who find ourselves competitive or otherwise ambitious, which I find to be totally fine. I don't want to criticize or blame competitiveness and ambition, is to think about what are the domains and aspects of practices where the competitiveness can be safely channeled and meaningfully channeled and where they're not helpful. And taking that issue to things like school, grades, our honor students in particular, but students at the University of Michigan in general are all good students. And they've gotten here by playing the competitive game of school because that's what they've been told to do. And trying to change that game on them can often be first bewildering and then hopefully, at least in some cases, liberating. So, for example, you may know that I've been involved, my pedagogy has been so-called gameful learning, which sounds competitive almost by definition, but in fact, it is not. So it's a way of trying to take the extrinsic motivations of competing, getting good grades and things like that unavoidably affect our students and making them think about how intrinsic motivation might fit in that. And then also taking some competitive aspects out. So in a different research project, which has been on hold because of my administrative work, I've been writing about things like how assignment structures are basically political economies of a certain kind. So ranking or curving rating scheme is a political economy of a certain kind, and I find extremely problematic one. So I've been trying to move away for things where students, by the very structure of the assignments, become interested in competing against one another. And so I've taken that competition out of it. So that's one example in which I've tried to put these practices that I've thought a lot about in place for our students, hoping for them to realize that it doesn't help to try to compete against other students in this class because everybody's going to get a good grade if they do the things we ask them to do. It's not graded on a curve, while still giving them challenges that allow them to try to improve on their previous paper or whatever it is. So that's one, I think, an important way that I've tried to fight the toxic ideology of overwork and ambition and competitiveness. Obviously, it's in higher education in general. Those are ecosystems that are difficult to change in piecemeal ways, but we have some of us who are trying to change that culture. So that's one important way. Another is simply to actually model better practices. And this is something I learned from a previous provost. This is a couple of provosts ago. Martha Pollack, who is now the president of Cornell University, often talked about the toxic ideology of overwork. And she often publicly said, I don't understand why people say that they have to work 90 hours a week being a professor. I've never worked more than 60 hours a week. And of course, that could sound like bragging, but the whole point was that she was modeling this idea that you need to have balance. And so that's one of the things I try to do as director of the honors program. We have a bunch of community building activities for our students. And one of them is formally called Adventures with the Director. Informally, we call it Crazy Shit with Mika, pardon the French. And I take students rock climbing, hiking, trail running to show that I have things that I care about. It's not that they have to start liking the things I do, but I want to model the fact that I have other things in my life. And in my wellness class, I have an assignment where they have to try to do something other than schoolwork and try to remind them that these are important. So that's, I think, an important aspect. It is so often true for many of us that we tell students or others that here's what you should do. And then we actually don't. We ourselves burn ourselves out. We are competitive. We participate in practices that are really problematic. On the one hand, it's important to recognize that nobody's perfect, and it's helpful to also model that. And one of the things I also do is talk a little bit about, back to the idea of fitspiration, how I find some fitspiration themes really helpful, inspiring, and recognize that maybe those are slightly problematic. So 3 things. I've tried to change the way I engage in my work practice so that I take some of the competitive aspects out. I try to model balance in life. I talk about the various kinds of things we do. And then I talk about the fact that it's hard, that I'm not perfect and nobody's perfect. So those are some of the ways in which I do that. And that gets us finally to the issues that students are really concerned about, which is, of course, they're concerned about their own futures, but their own individual futures, jobs, getting into med school, getting into law school, getting into business school. For our students, those are the modal types. But they're also concerned about the world, and then trying to get them to not be concerned, but to think, again, use this idea of wellness to get them understanding that there are some choices that they can control, and those sometimes can have impacts on the broader issues that they can't control at all or can at best influence a little bit. But it's to recognize that they have some agency, and recognizing the agency and then recognizing broader issues. So I think that's, again, one of my goals in all this just focus on wellness is to address the broader issues of climate anxiety, political anxiety in the world right now. There's a lot of pain about the global situations on campus. There's, of course, a lot of anxiety about the political issues this year, this election year. So those personal choices that I suggest students think about are ways of trying to have them develop some ways of recognizing areas that they can control and areas that they can control, but hopefully can at least have an understanding of. And the final thing, and this is something that I've been really thinking about a lot since the early teens, is this idea of uncertainty. So my political theory work, if it has to fit in a particular theory, it's liberalism, which in American political culture usually means left progressive. I might identify as those things, but liberalism is basically ultimately the idea that individuals are probably the best judges of what their own good is, but that also leads to fundamentally this idea that politics is about compromise. And so that's connected to the issues of uncertainty in the sense that there's a kind of intellectual, political humility, ethical humility that I might be wrong. The world is a complicated place and I might be wrong and the world is really uncertain. So what should I do? I should try to make choices that I think are good for me, that are evidence-based, that are ethical, but also recognizing that there are different perspectives, that I might be wrong, and also recognizing that uncertainty is in some ways not a bad thing. So that's, again, a lot of concepts weirdly connected, but hopefully they fit together for our students. At least I've gotten some sense from some of our students that they appreciate that.
Thank you so much. You're bringing up many important themes, and I want to make sure that we can tackle each of these as best we can. I want to circle back on your reflection on your own self and how you take some of these principles and concepts and put them into practice for yourself. So you had mentioned 3 key points when it comes to what you do for yourself. The first has to do with work. And if I'm hearing you correctly, taking some of the competitiveness out of work. The second has to do with modeling. And the third has to do with very clearly acknowledging that this is a work in process and this is hard. Can you talk a little bit in more detail about 1 and 2? And specific with 1, how you as someone who identifies as competitive, can do that for yourself and what that looks like in practice from the work lens. And then when it comes to the modeling piece, we've talked a little bit about your findings from the research and how you are trying to model healthy practices for students. Anything more you can share in terms of how you decide what you share, whether for a student audience or more?
Yeah. So first, I'm thinking about work. I guess it's again connected to this idea that we are more than our jobs. That, as I said, I'm trying to get students thinking beyond the MCAT, the LSAT, the GMAT, the GRE, the grades, and recognizing that what meaningful life ought to be has lots of different elements. And I know that there are lots of people, there are some faculty who say that college should suck because the good things are afterward, or grad school should suck, or law school is miserable, but that's okay because then you'll make a lot of money. And I think that's unhelpful and it's also not true. These are important elements. It's not that I'm advocating hedonism, don't think about tomorrow at all, like just live in the moment, but think about what are the sources of meaning for our lives. And so what is really important? Maybe I've been long enough in this world-class research university full of incredibly smart people, both students, faculty, and staff, both students, faculty, and staff, that I realized that I'm not going to be the most successful person here. I'm not the smartest person here. No matter what I do, I'm not going to be the most successful one. And then realizing that I don't need to be. I don't even need to try to be. So recognizing the areas where I find that I'm good enough. So here's the paradox. I think about this in the context of students. So the paradox of the University of Michigan student is they come here wanting to change the world, which is really great. It's commendable that this generation of students in particular wants to change the world in all kinds of cool ways that's much more inclusive and non-dogmatic than my radicalism in the 1980s was. So it's really great. So they come here wanting to change the world. And often that is very ambitious. They want to be the best prosecutor of sexual violence. They want to become a senator from this area where their identity has never been a senator. They want to be the best doctor. They want to, whatever, they want to cure cancer and everything else, which is really great. And so the paradox is that most of our students, when they graduate, they're going to have jobs. They're going to have jobs, period. Not the best job in the world, not the president of the US, not senators. Some will. If you look at the history of University of Michigan students, they've done really well. But the paradox is vast majority of those people are going to have ordinary jobs broadly understood. And that's a good thing because they can make a difference that way. One of my favorite examples is a former student. She was a student in the mid-aughts, and ended up going to a law school here at Michigan too. And she ended up, she was really involved on campus anti-sexual assault practices, which was really great. And she was hoping to become maybe a defense attorney or maybe a prosecutor about people who commit sexual violence. And she ended up, for various reasons, getting a job at a firm involved with some business practices, which when I think of business practices, especially something like real estate, to me, I can't think of anything more boring, but that's just me. But so that might seem like, oh my God, what a disappointment. But she ended up being the first partner in her firm who got to work from home when she had her first child. And so she was able to put her commitments, her values, her politics into practice in a different way, and in a maybe smaller scale way, but maybe one that's more impactful. So the paradox is like getting students to not abandon their values, but maybe recognizing that their competitiveness doesn't necessarily get realized by becoming the most successful, the winner, whatever that winner means, but getting to practice it in a setting in which they can make a difference to somebody else. So that is the way I try to talk about it to my students. And it's something that I've come to recognize, maybe because somebody might say, I am not that successful. So I have made some choices. in my practice that many of my colleagues actually call into question, like focusing on teaching more than research. But I'm at a point where I feel comfortable about that. And also then thinking about how do I convey that. So that connects to your second question, which is how to model these kinds of practices. So I am really anal about things like tracking my workouts. I've tracked on varieties of platforms all of my workouts since 1997. So I'm a data nerd and I'm not advocating that. So I'm very interested in making sure that I do that. I want to see am I improving and things like that. But also I want to recognize and convey to not just to my students, but anybody who's interested that I don't work all the time. I make lots of choices. In particular, when the pandemic started, I decided that the first thing I'll journal every day in the morning. And today we're recording on day 1405 since the pandemic began because I have counted because I've written a journal every morning. And it's the first thing I do. I don't look at email. I don't do any work. I also every day do some kind of workout. I'm not totally committed to streaking because I think it's helpful to recognize that I don't have to work out every day, but I work out almost every day. So last calendar year, I worked out on 329 days because I track it. Yes, I need an intervention. And then I started playing the guitar and then the banjo and then the bass and then the keyboard during the pandemic. And I try to make time at least 3 times a week for those kinds of things. And then I try to have time to spend with my wife. I want to walk the dog. I want to do time wasting activities and share these practices with others so that people can see that here's my approach to trying to lead a slightly more holistic life than the culture suggests that our students should. Not perfect. And not that I'm advocating, again, my approach doesn't have to be your approach, but this idea that I made choices that right now are the sources of meaning for me. And that to me is, in fact, much better and much more rewarding than some kind of professional success or things like that.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think there's much that our listeners can take away from that in terms of putting your frameworks into practice. And I can say from my own evolution over time, I talked a bit about my undergraduate experience. When it came to my graduate experience, my sport, so to speak, was still grades. And I was making unhealthy decisions for quite a while in terms of that pursuit of metrics, pursuit of grades, wanting to add value in every single conversation and holding myself to what became an impossible standard because I was getting sleep, was getting maybe 5 hours of sleep a night and trying to do everything, even in an environment where it was very clear that you needed to pick your priorities and that from day one, it wasn't going to be possible to do all the things. I wanted to network and get to know people. I wanted to always create value in the classroom conversation. I also cared very deeply about academic performance. And when we put that kind of pressure on ourselves, we can make poor decisions. Cutting sleep being one of them, cutting fitness out of the priority list was another. I wasn't being particularly mindful about nutrition choices. And certainly to your earlier point around doping, while I regret this in hindsight, I even took Adderall at one point, even though I do not have an ADHD diagnosis. A family member does. And my use of Adderall was brief. It is not something I'm proud of. I have no problem with people taking their own Adderall prescriptions, but I had not been prescribed Adderall as I did not and do not have an ADHD diagnosis. I took Adderall because I placed such intense pressure on myself and my academic performance, and I was cutting sleep, and I was having trouble focusing, and I decided, which I regret in hindsight, that was an appropriate path forward. So I really appreciate you talking about ways to define our own measures of success and what success means to us. That has changed for me dramatically over time. It was never about money. But as I mentioned, I can get very into metrics of very different kinds. And even having gotten clear about my priorities and values, I have to make decisions every day when it comes to the fitness metrics. So I still see parallels between the kinds of pressure I put on grades then and the kind of pressure I put on fitness metrics now. Really appreciate you sharing all of that.
I think we all have examples of that. And again, it's important to become aware of them and try to reflect on them without guilt tripping yourself. And at the same time, thinking about what is problematic about them and how to change the practices that are most problematic wi- without, again, at the same time saying, okay, no more working out, no more logging workouts, because it's also a source of meaning. So I think I talked earlier about the importance of recognizing uncertainty and embracing it as unavoidable. And the other is recognizing the complexity. And that's one of the issues in our current moment is not just are we politically polarized, but there's this sense of a kind of intellectual dogmatism. It's either or, it's one thing or another. And that's not really helpful. And I always feel like the world is more complex than that. And that, again, back to what for me is the politics of liberalism. People think differently. There are many possible perspectives, and that's because the world is such a complex place. So recognizing that my practices might be good and bad, or let's remove even those terms and say that might have beneficial aspects and meaningful things for me, and at the same time might be not ideal.
I hear you. And what I'm hearing you say is number one, when we look at any of these issues, two things can be true, right? So something can be beneficial for some or beneficial for many people, and also have aspects that can be taken too far or taken to a different degree or maybe problematic for others. And that this is an individual process that we each need to navigate, and how we present options, how we share frameworks and best practices is up to us to be able to be as informed as we can and try to mitigate some of the potential negative effects. And that individuals need to feel empowered to try different things and find what works for them in any of the contexts that we've talked about, with certainly wellness being a key example.
I agree.
We talked very briefly about climate anxiety. And I would say when I hear what you just shared, climate is one example that comes to mind. Well, we may have different perspectives on the choices we make, how those connect with climate, the prioritization we place on climate. When you think about bridging what you just shared and recognizing that some students have quite a bit of anxiety about climate related themes, and others may be focused on other themes, but can also benefit from some of these frameworks or approaches. What have you been finding has been helpful for students, or how have you been approaching that conversation with students? How does that connect to the themes we were just discussing?
On climate anxiety in particular, one of the key differences between my generation and younger generations is simply that they're going to have to deal with whatever the consequences are longer, or deal with them, period. So it's conceivable that the worst effects of climate change, even though there already have been significant bad ones, won't ever affect my personal life more than more power outages, maybe flooding on the backyard, but none of the broader things. So recognizing that they are in a different position. And so their anxiety, the reality of their anxiety might be much greater for good reasons. So there's an important sense of anti-paternalism and humility when we talk to our students, especially younger people in general, but our students in particular, about this. So I've gotten to an age where when I reflect back on my youthful self, the inevitable paternalism of, oh, but wait till you get older and you'll see X, Y, and Z is true about lots of things, but not about climate change. There, I think we don't know. And so my first step is to try to be as little, I usually try to be anti-paternalist in general, telling students here's what you need to believe. But on that issue in particular, and hear them, but then also to try to think about resources for being realistic about the challenges. And so on these issues with our students, I've turned to literature or other writers. So a couple of years ago in the honors program, our summer reading was Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry for the Future, which is this speculative fiction about climate change that is completely realistic about lots of things and at the same time hopeful. Or last summer, our reading was Anthony Doerr's Cloud Cuckoo Land, which is a fantastic novel about lots of things, but also about the way in which throughout history, many generations have had moments in which their lives, their worlds have radically changed, sometimes to horrible degrees. So it's not optimistic, naively or Pollyanna-ish. Oh, don't worry, shit has happened before. It's all going to be fine. But there are these upheavals, but there can be hope despite that. So finding nuanced sources of hope, I feel inadequate myself. So art, speculative art in particular, is a way of doing that. I think that's one area. And then just thinking about some of the ways in which student activism of varieties of kinds, some of which I endorse and some of which I don't, can be actually genuinely impactful, not just as a source of meaning or alleviation of the climate anxiety, but actually has had impact. For example, the University of Michigan current president, President Ono, was the first University of Michigan official who explicitly used the phrase climate emergency. Now, I was not involved in the selection, but my sense is that it was student activism, student pressure on the regents and the search to emphasize that this is really important. This has to be a priority of the next president. That played a role, wasn't the sole determining factor, but played a role in the selection of President Ono, which I think is a good example. So there are things that can be done. Are they going to be enough? I hope they will be. So thinking of ways of responsibly framing the gravity of the situation, putting it in broader context and thinking, what are the sources of hope? What are the ways in which we can think about hope that are meaningful and liberating? Going back to my philosophical roots, Immanuel Kant, the 18th century German philosopher, is one of my main guys. My political theory stems from his work, and I've written some explicit stuff on him. And Kant had this famous argumentative strategy, which he called transcendental arguments, which has nothing to do with meditation. But the simplest way, maybe too simplistic, but the simplest way I can put it is to say, we cannot positively prove that X is true. And for Kant, it was existence of God or human progress or knowledge of the external world or the fact that ethics is real. And so we cannot prove that. What is the only way for us to go on living? It is to assume as if it is possible to have an afterlife. Not my thing, but again, for 18th century Europeans, this idea that there might be an afterlife. We have to assume that humankind can improve. So basically the idea is that what's the as if that should guide our action to give us hope? And it cannot be naive. It can't just be like, it can be anything, but what is the thing that makes it possible for us to continue to live, to make choices, to make any kinds of actions? And it's most famous, this style of argument is most famous in his ethics, which can get complicated, but the idea is that does ethics make sense at all? And he offers an argument that says that if we assume that there can be no such thing, that I ought to do X, I ought not to do Y, then life doesn't make sense. And this is all the Kant scholars listening to this is simplifying things a bit, but I find it pretty helpful. And again, thinking about climate change, because if you say that we are doomed, what do you do? And if you assume that possibility of us not being doomed, it doesn't tell you what to do, but gives you a sense that there ought to be something you can do. And so it has no implications of what you should do. It doesn't say do X or Y, be climate radical or be climate moderate or anything, but it is just like, how do I orient my life? So that's how I think about it.
Thank you so much for sharing that. First, Kant is one of my favorite philosophers, particularly given his voice for animal welfare. So I really love that we can bring him into this conversation. And when it comes to the examples you've raised in terms of leadership, President Pollock and President Ono have certainly led a variety of different efforts related to sustainability that I've been grateful to follow and appreciate you elevating their perspectives and the broader work, specifically at the University of Michigan. I would say what you're talking about resonates with me very deeply. And I've only recently started talking about some experiences and some aspects of my identity, including anxiety, OCD, and being a bi member of the LGBTQIA plus community. And when I think about those aspects of my identity and more about my day-to-day experiences, the food choices I make provide me an opportunity to do what I feel is at the core of what you're describing, which is to be able to put aside these massive problems that I know I am not capable of solving, at least today, whether we're talking about animal welfare, whether we're talking about human health and well-being, whether we're talking about themes related to the planet. But it's one thing I can do in that moment, and presumably at least 3 times a day. And that helps me feel very empowered. I think to the earlier part of the conversation, you're talking about the fact that there are a lot of different perspectives, political and across a variety of these different themes. It doesn't have to just be climate. Climate is one theme that I do have anxiety about. And my food choices help me feel empowered to make a choice that's good for people, animals, and the planet in that moment. But it can be other things. It can be health for me. It can be health and being a caregiver, in my case, for an animal, for others, for humans. I think if we can tap into what that motivation is, and if we can remind ourselves that I can't necessarily solve the broader problems, I can't necessarily say what things are going to look like even a decade from now, but I can make a choice right now that's good for me, that's good for my family, that's good for animals, that's good for the planet, whatever resonates with us, then we can put exactly what you're describing into practice in a small but very actionable way that is built already into our day. And that for me can be meditative, can be empowering, and can feel like I accomplished something, even on the days where other things didn't go according to schedule. So for me, the food choice piece is really at the core of that. And I'm a strong advocate for veganism and plant-based choices and making plant-based choices even once a week. It can provide that exercise and that meditation. That's been for my journey, while I'm still grappling with many of the themes we've talked about, that for me is the one practice that I can rely on for that sense of empowerment and that sense of anxiety reduction in any of these themes we're talking about on a daily basis.
Right. I agree. I think it's important to think about, again, what do I have control over, and think about those as choices. One of the things that's interesting for me, again, from the perspective of philosophical ethics, is that Kant is often seen as the philosopher of principles, and that is true. But, and I have a longer story, which I won't get into, but for me, it's actually consistent with his kind of ethics, or whatever kind of ethics you want to care about, to actually not have absolute principles. And I mentioned this because you talk about your food choices. So I've been pescatarian just a little over 30 years. And when people ask me, why don't you eat meat? I used to be a little more obnoxious and say, why do you eat meat? But actually, the reality is that more people eat meat. So it's perfectly reasonable to ask about the exception. Fortunately, there are more and more of us who make choices that don't involve eating meat or eating land animals or different kinds of choices. But so my pescatarianism is in some ways, in a principled way, unprincipled. So The example I often use is that if I had to offend your grandmother by refusing to eat her chicken or her beef, I would not offend her. I would eat, because that's a choice that also is an ethical choice of respect. Again, I'm not saying that it should be it's the right ethical food choice, but it is how I think about it. That food is cultural, it's social, it's all kinds of things, it's ecological. And so in some settings, respect for norms, respect for others, human civility requires that I make choices that just I don't insist on my choices. Again, not criticizing people who insist on their choices, because there's also politics around this. So sometimes reminding that, hey, wait a minute, what about the vegetarians or the vegans in this group is a reasonable thing. But so when people ask me, what are your principles? I don't have a single principle. It's combination of all things considered. It's better to try to reduce animal suffering, especially through factory farming and the really horrible practices for large intelligent animals. It is also better ecologically in terms of climate for lots of different reasons. I'm a scuba diver, so I have actually hung around with lots of fish, and I know how smart they are, so I shouldn't be eating fish, but I am. And that's an area where I could say that I am a hypocrite, but I do try to make choices of actually having sustainably caught fish, whether it's sustainably farmed, like some fish like tilapia can be, or line caught and things like that. And so I don't have a single principle. I'm just thinking, what are the choices that allow me to try to minimize bad insofar as I understand it, recognizing that my knowledge is not perfect and I don't have time to learn about every possible choice. Like nobody has time to learn about every possible choice. So that's why I have been a pescatarian for last 30 years. And is it the most principled way of making food choices? No, but it is that makes sense for me. And then it connects to what you were just talking about. It's a source of kind of meditative practice. And for me, it's eating and also cooking. I love cooking. I love trying new things. Right now, it's really fun and interesting to practice with these new alternatives to meat, not because I crave meatballs, but it is fun to try to make Beyond Beef meatballs and I like them. And I know I have many vegetarian friends who say that the very thought of the meat likeness of Beyond Beef grosses them out. Totally understand that. Lisa, food almost by definition is a matter of taste. So there's going to be issue of taste on top of or in conjunction with the broader ethical issues. And that's totally fine. So this is a long-winded way of saying that in a way, even though our exact practices are different, I think our way of thinking about them is pretty similar.
I appreciate you emphasizing that, number one, that animal suffering is part of the equation when you think about the food choices that you make, and that there are a wide range of factors, including how we were brought up, the cultures that we consider ourselves a part of, the social factors, and more. And that cooking in and of itself is a meditative practice. And I think from where we started the conversation, I appreciate how you shared how you look at your own decisions and recognize where there may be consistencies and inconsistencies, where there are principles or where we don't have principles, and continuing to approach our processes with an open mind. To your point about cultivated meat, and I certainly hear you. I've been trying to expand the food choices I'm making within the vegan foods, recognizing that there may be things I have avoided because they resemble meat, or things that are just simply not part of the way I cook today, but trying to help increase the engagement with the conversation and also just better understand different cultures and how plant-based and vegan choices can fit within theirs. So really appreciate everything that you're sharing and certainly see alignment. I would feel remiss if we didn't touch briefly on your and your wife's commitment to animal welfare through companion animal adoption. Would love to hear anything you'd be willing to share in terms of your commitment to adopting, your experience with special needs animal care, and any advice you'd have for those considering animal adoption.
I've loved animals all my life. And when my wife and I got together in graduate school, I became the stepfather to the two kitties she had since they were kittens. They had been farm cats from Wisconsin, and they lived for a very long time. And they were around 15, both developed health issues. And they lived far beyond that. One died at 20 and one died at 21. For the last 5 years of their lives, we became, of necessity, pretty good, I hope, pretty good caretakers for elderly kitties with health issues. One had subcutaneous fluids every day for several years. Both had different medications. And we realized that elder care, whether it's humans or animals, is taxing, but we felt that's something we knew how to do. And then when they both passed, we adopted from Humane Society of Huron Valley here in town these two kitties that were actually had been partner kitties together. They were BFFs, as they call them. And they were both older. And one of them ended up developing cancer and promptly died after just 6 months. But the other lived to 23. She died 2 years ago. And amazingly, this is all Danielle's doing, but she had pancreatitis when she was 17 and then developed type 3 feline diabetes as a result of some of the medication she had to be on. And thanks to the work of our fantastic then vet and Danielle, we got her into full remission from the diabetes. But she was old and she had lots of health issues. So she lived a long time. We had also, after her BFF died, we adopted another kitty who also ended up developing health issues and eventually cancer. And so we feel like we're pretty good at taking care of elderly kitties. And then both of our previous dogs ended up developing lots of health issues that we had to take care of. And we only adopt pets. Again, for me, buying a pet, I would not be able to justify buying a pet, even from a responsible trainer. But I also understand that people have different commitments, so I don't judge people. Sometimes, especially for dogs, it's the humane societies and shelters tend to be full of pit mixes. And even though I think that they are badly maligned, it's understandable, especially if you have children. It can be a complicated choice and things like that. It's so hard to know. When we adopted our previous dog, we tried before for a 75-pound pit mix that we realized at that point would not have been compatible with our cats. And we were not compatible as caretakers for a dog like that. But now last summer, we adopted a wonderful pit mix and we're very happy with her and we hope she's very happy with us. So we feel like adopting is the way to go in general with animals, given the culture around pets. That's our principle. Again, not insisting it for others. And then when we can, especially with cats, adopting older kitties because we know how to take care of them and they are harder to get adopted. So those are the reasons we make the choices. It's not some kind of moral high ground. I think that, I don't know, I hope I'm not righteous and holier than thou. I can't stand people like that who talk about their virtue. So we ended up being good in terms of skills and abilities and our life situation where we can do that. And so that's why we made those choices. Not saying we don't have a bumper sticker that says adopt, don't buy. I have nothing against those bumper stickers, but that's not our principle. Our principle is we can do this, so we should do it. It makes sense for us, but we also are like so many people who love animals. We look at Humane Society website and we would like to adopt every pet, and it just is not possible. So also recognizing that we can't do everything. But Danielle is volunteering at the Humane Society. So we make choices that hopefully are consistent with our principles.
Absolutely. I appreciate you sharing your experiences. And I hear you that we may not all be in a position to do at home medical care. And sharing your experiences, I think, helps others who may be in a position to do that or may be interested to learn more to recognize that there are resources available. There are ways to learn about what that at home care entails, hopefully help to increase the number of animals that need some assistance at home in being adopted. And I certainly respect your consideration for different pathways to pet parenthood. I grew up with a dog that was purchased from a breeder and his companion who had originally been purchased from a breeder and then my family adopted from a different family. Rehomed would be the most accurate term. And so loved those dogs and absolutely loved my experience being a dog and cat caregiver growing up. And am someone that actively posts adopt, don't shop at this point. So I certainly see both sides to the picture. I think for me, the number of animals being euthanized out of sheer lack of available space in shelters and other environments is a key part of that. And so while I actively promote adopt, don't shop, I also, through the work of C plus B, support pet parents, no matter how they became pet parents, in the spaces between veterinary visits when it comes to at home care, the veterinary teams who we know are experiencing tremendous demand, and the companion animals. So, really appreciate you sharing candidly about that. For those that do know they are interested in adoption, what advice would you share?
I think adopting for or acquiring, so I'd even broaden it, acquiring an animal for the right reasons. So the most common reason, which was true when I was a kid, was the kids in the family want a dog or a cat, but usually it's a dog. And it is an easy thing to succumb to for parents. I'm not a parent, so I don't know, but I can easily imagine and recognizing that every time kids say, yes, we will walk them, is never true. Not because kids are bad, but it's just adults have a hard time imagining what the reality of any new situation is. And it's unreasonable to to expect kids to do that. So recognizing that it's especially getting this sort of the pandemic pet that we saw. There are so many dogs I used to see walked all the time during the pandemic in our neighborhood, and I don't see them walk anymore. And so that to me is a good example of maybe making choices for a bad reason. And that is one of the reasons that then helps generate this overabundance of pets. For better or for worse, the number of domesticated animals, cats and dogs in particular, is completely dependent on human choices and human activities in a complicated way that we don't need to get into. I guess my suggestion would be don't become a pet parent unless you really know why you want to do that. In some ways, it's as difficult and as complicated a decision as having a child, and in different ways. And this is not at all, again, I hate the debates about moral equivalence of children and pets. And I think that those are not helpful. But so thinking about why one wants a pet. And so the responsible thing is maybe not to do it. And at the same time, given the number of pets and shelters, I would encourage people to think about pets. So I don't know, what to consider. Most recently, given our experiences, said, let's fight the horrible stigma against pit mixes, which has to do more with how people treat pit mixes. They are not cruel dogs. They are not fighting dogs by nature. But at the same time, Mabel, our current dog, and our previous dog, Hershey was some small mutt. Mabel can destroy something and probably could break bones if she wanted to. So it's also important to recognize that pit mixes are wonderful, loving dogs, but they have physiques that are potentially incompatible with some things. But it's not So the stereotype about them as being dangerous is just really unhelpful, especially given that so many shelter dogs are varieties of pit mixes. So consider a pit mix and remember that according to at least some histories, they were trained to protect children. So they are protecting dogs and capable of aggressive and violent behavior, but at the same time, they are loving and sweet, which is their instinct. So again, thinking about like finding out about what you want. And just because the golden doodle is the hippest dog in town at the moment, or whatever is the most trendy dog, those to me are always bad reasons. Whether it's a golden or golden doodle or anything like that. There's something helpful, again, in the macro sense to think about how is it that people's willingness to appreciate mutts led to now this insidious culture of luxury boutique mutts, golden doodles, and all of those things. So this is nothing against any of the dogs like that, but they are now being bred. And that was not the point. It was at first people were willing to say, hey, I don't care. Mutts are hybrid vigor, all of that. That's great. And then, oh, but those are so cute. Let's make sure that we get a golden doodle or multipool or whatever you want. And that is, again, the broader issue, which is not, has no implications for an individual action other than that if you want a golden doodle, wait till your Humane Society gets one as opposed to don't go to a golden doodle breeder. That's my bit of dogmatism.
Thank you. There's so much to what you just shared. I absolutely agree when it comes to bridging the concept of, as you mentioned, whether you're attracted to a particular breed, have a particular type of dog in mind, and the need to support shelters, working with your shelters, leveraging online tools to track availability makes adoption a viable option, even if you have a particular breed in mind in many cases. However, I have become more and more aware of the bias, not only against pit bulls, but against other breeds as well. And there's a particular article that I love that Malcolm Gladwell wrote back in 2006 about the changing nature of the trends and the sort of public view or the personification of different breeds over time. And to your point about pit bulls having many positive qualities that were emphasized at various times, the article highlights that stereotypes exist for pit bulls and for many other breeds are based on a wide range of factors that many times do not align with data. And to me, suggests that we, instead of focusing on generalizations, should be asking questions that get back to some of your earlier points. Will this animal be compatible with animals who are already in the home? Will this animal be compatible with us as pet parents? Will this animal be compatible with children or other family members? And there are frameworks that we can use, and many shelters have been working to develop resources to help ease the adoption process, to ensure pets have the greatest likelihood of success of being placed with families that are well aligned and compatible. And much of this can be done on the front end of the adoption process to find a good match. And I really appreciate your point about not only supporting pit mixes, but the love that you have for Mabel and that she brings to your home. And as someone who adopted in the category of what you're describing. So Cody, who was the namesake for the C in C+B, was specifically chosen from a county pound because he was about to run out of time. And if someone saw him on the street, might think I chose him because he was a combination of breeds, presumably. I didn't have a DNA test, but presumably it was an Australian Shepherd Golden Retriever mix, which was exactly what you're describing. It was a designer hybrid at one point or another. Now, he did not look particularly much like either of those breeds when he was coming home from the pound because he had a number of different issues that needed to be addressed. And I spoke about these in a previous podcast episode, so I won't spend our time here on that. But he was certainly not chosen based on his looks. He was chosen to try to give him time with us in the home as opposed to running out of time in a pound environment. So there can be a lot of different factors, and we may be drawn to the aesthetics of a particular breed. But what I appreciate so much about what you're sharing is the bond that we have with an animal and the compatibility from the factors that really matter most when it comes to other animals in the home, other people in the home. Does this animal work well with our lifestyle, with the time and effort and energy we are willing to put in realistically when it comes to daily exercise and care and more? Those considerations need to be considered on the front end. And while we could have a whole other conversation around parallels and differences between caregiving for humans and caregiving for animals, I really appreciate everything you've spoken about in terms of reflecting on our human experiences before bringing an animal into our lives. So thank you so much for that.
Thank-
When it comes to all the themes that we've touched on, are there any additional points you'd like to share with our listeners to wrap things up, to bring things together, or things we haven't yet touched upon?
I don't think there's a way to wrap up everything we've talked about, except maybe the themes that have motivated my academic thinking, my work, and my teaching, and my other choices, which is trying to appreciate complexity and nuance in a moment where dogmatism, lack of nuance, and oppositional thinking are dominant. Maybe that's a cliche thing to say, but I think it's a key thing at this point, whether it's about how to lead a life in the contemporary world, what choices to make about your wellness and well-being, or your food choices, and what to do for living, and all of that. So it's more complicated than that. It turns out to be the one conclusion that's universal in all social science research. There was a humorous meta study of all social science, and they found three things. Some don't. The differences are smaller than you think, and it's more complex than that. That's basically the theme of what we talked.
Very important takeaways for every aspect of this conversation. I really appreciate you sharing that. Thank you so much. For those that want to learn more about you and your work, where can they go?
They can do a Google search or library search if they have access. They can go to the Political Science, University of Michigan Department of Political Science website, or the LSA Honors Program website at the University of Michigan, which just links to what I've done. And I think that's a good place to start. And I'm always happy to actually respond to people's emails. So you can find my email on the magical interwebs and I will respond.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll make sure to include those links. And this has been such an inspiring conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights and your experiences, as well as practical strategies for those looking to make changes in a variety of different ways. Thank you so much, Mika.
Here.
Thanks so much for joining this episode of the Compassionate and Beneficial Living podcast. Please follow, subscribe, share your comments, share with others, and let us know what topics you'd like to hear covered next.